I am very pleased to introduce John McTernan. So, John, no pressure. I've known John McTernan for many years. He was special advisor to Henry McLeish, the First Minister in Scotland, and everything good comes out of Scotland. He then worked as a journalist. He's been a journalist and broadcaster writing for the FT, the Telegraph, and the Scotsman. He worked then in Number 10 for Tony Blair for a significant period of time, and has subsequently worked on the other side of the world as a special advisor and in communications for Julia Gillard, the Prime Minister of Australia. He has a unique perspective. He works with many corporate clients, and he has had some very interesting perspectives. In one of our programs just over 18 months ago, he said that the curtain was coming down on some of the big organizing principles that had originated in the 80s, and that new organizing paradigms would have to be picked up by managers and public policy makers. So it's a hard time to answer this question, but John McTernan, over to you.
Well, thank you, Neil, and thank you for that introduction. Thank you, everybody, for your time. I'm going to start off with probably my major observation about coronavirus, the pandemic, the period we're living in, which is almost everybody says they want to build back better. The problem with that is who's going to argue that they want to build back worse. It's not a principle that allows you to choose between different forms of action. And that is the question of leadership, because to lead is to choose. In my view, very many people take the pandemic and they see it as a mirror that reflects back to them the requirement for their personal preferred policy solution. I think it's best to see the pandemic as a lamp that's shining a harsh light onto the status quo, really clearly showing us things about that we knew already, about homelessness or about health inequalities, or about the thing which no one talks about in a way because it's too obvious, but is actually very serious. From the very outset of the pandemic, the government's mantra is that we should stay at home, protect the NHS, which is a reversal of the historic function of the NHS. The job of the NHS is to protect us. The only reason we have to protect the NHS is that up until the pandemic, it had been running so hot. It was running at and over capacity because it had had the longest sustained period of funding reductions of any health system, any comparable health system anywhere in the world ever. So the reason we have to protect the NHS is so that the government don't have to talk about the capacity constraints that they had baked into the NHS with 10 years of running in the way that they had. I think the problem about building back better, the fundamental challenge is it is very hard to make change. And it takes what Neil talked about, what's the beverage moment take? It takes a historic moment of need, a shared notion that we have to do something together, which we have. It takes in-depth thinking and preparation, because the fact is that during the war, a lot of thinking was going on about the country that would be made after the war. The Education Act, which was a settlement for the 50s and 60s, the Butler Act, was written in 1944. In fact, civil servants in the Department for Education were told in the early 1940, go away from the department and don't come back till you have a plan for post-war education. A lot of resources invested. There were royal commissions. Lord Reith looked at new towns and the planning system. A lot of what was brought to fruition in the 1945 Labour government was by and large cross-party in outcome. It wasn't always cross-party in exact design as the NHS debates should. But there were 5 to 10 years worth of policy debates, policy concerns underpinning them. And so I think we don't necessarily have the time to do that deep thinking. We do have the need, and we probably have the capacity with it in the way the expansion of the number of people involved in policy conversations. There's a lot of thinking out there to draw together, and perhaps we could do that, and we should do that. But first, what have we learned during the pandemic? We've all learned to use Teams or Zoom, whatever your preference is. So we've actually found that a lot of white-collar work can be very effectively done from home. That's good. I think we've also found that we miss not our commute, but we miss our office, we miss our colleagues. And I think that's the serendipitous nature of life. So much of the creative side of what you do in organizations isn't task and finish. It is bumping into colleagues, having conversations, going for a drink, having a coffee, going for lunch. That has been rubbed out, and I've not yet found anywhere a successful substitute for that on Zoom or Teams or any of the platforms that people use. I know people hold quizzes, which have worked, and people hold, there are other forms of party apps that have worked, but I've not found one that brings that serendipitous creativity and collision and connection into work. I think there's a debate which has been going on about what this tells us about work and life. And I think, when you spend all your time at the office, you neglect your family. And now when you're at home, you spend all your time in the office and in your home at the same time simultaneously. I think the ability to close your front door and go to work and close your office door and go home is an important barrier. And the erosion of those barriers, it has been to the benefit of companies. I think almost every survey I've seen suggests that companies have had more work productivity out of their staff, not less during this, despite the fact that many parents are also teachers part-time or teaching assistants part-time at the moment. What's the new organizing principle going to be? That, I think the question is still open from the conversation that I started at an event with Neil before. I think we can see a new policy framework emerging. At my most cynical, I call it Milibandism. We live in a world where many of the things that were proposed by Ed Miliband when he was leaving the Labour Party are now Conservative Party policy. An energy price cap is a really good symbolic one. Form of communism when Ed Miliband suggested it. Rational common sense when the May and Johnson governments do it. Actually a very ineffective intervention into the market. But I think one of the things we've seen is a collapse of anybody arguing very strongly on market principles for anything at the moment. We've actually got a cross-party consensus on lots of issues that impact on business, and they can probably be read into broader organizational form. The debate this week about genocide and not having trade treaties with countries which are committing genocide is a part of a whole debate about the ethics of business, the ethics of supply chain, of sourcing, which is cross-party. It was a Tory backbencher, former Tory minister who moved the genocide amendment. It was a Tory-led select committee. It was a Tory-led Foreign Affairs Select Committee in coordination with a Labour-led Business Select Committee, which have been looking at forced labour in the supply chain. These issues are going to come back again and again because there's a broad consensus on both sides of politics that the ethics of business, the ethics of sourcing, the values of business are a thing which should be scrutinised by politicians. In this, they are responding to the public, but I think they're responding to a very small a small number of the public, a large number of vocal campaigning NGOs, but this is almost early adoption by politicians of themes around ethics and values. And I think this will be a big issue of the next 5-10 years. And it's a big part of what the global Britain agenda of the Conservative government is. The very fact that the G7 this summer is going to be a D10 as well as a G7, the 10 democracies meeting together is a sign of the intent of Dominic Raab in the new merged Foreign Office and Development Department. On to the another things around which there are consensus. If anybody who saw the Prime Minister speak to Andrew Marr in his New Year interview, his first of the year, he talked about levelling up, localism, devolution, inequality, COP26, the environment, the green agenda, climate change. Those are issues which Keir Starmer could have talked about. There is a growing consensus about what the issues as well, the domestic issues, which are quite they're value-driven issues, but those are that consensus. The thing that I talked about before about the organizational form and has the new public management run its course, has purchaser-provider split run its course, I still think that is a big central question. the public service model, whose weaknesses, flaws were tragically exposed at Grenfell, is still there because nobody has articulated an alternative. At the moment, there's a conversation around should outsourcing become insourcing? Maybe it should. But as Neil said, both he and I are old enough to have lived through the 70s. And there is in a sense in which some of the debate in Britain is returning to, let's have more municipalisation. So big council house building being the solution to housing, bringing services in-house rather than outsourcing them being the solution for them. And that, economically, there's huge concern now that as the economies of the world wake up after the pandemic, there's a potential for inflation. So we could be back in the world of the 1970s in all kinds of ways. The questions that we need to ask looking to the future, I touched on beverage. We need to take the crying social issues and unpack them and then repack them. So there's no doubt that social care has to stop being a footnote in speeches by prime ministers who want to give a sense of the future. Social care workers are clearly not treated equally to healthcare workers, yet they provide a vital function. The need for the modernisation of social care is one of the big domestic issues. The housing issue I touched on before, and the pensions. I think that the current financial situation, with the long-term low interest rates, apparently, it's causing a crisis, a long-run crisis in pension provision. Three big public policy issues there: health and social care, housing, and pensions, all of which are going to require the kind of imagination of the beverage resetting. So coming back to where I started when Neil set me off, is this a beverage moment? It should be. It must be. It could be. But it does require the ability to draw together the thinking so that you actually may need the slow thinking of a Royal Commission, or you may need the slow thinking of more parliamentary committees. What you do need to say is we need a public debate on these things, and we need to accept that some of these will be generational in finally delivering. Because the one thing about the beverage moment is that they thought deeply for 5 or 10 years. They realized it would take 5, 10, 15, 20 years for the answers to come through. And I think we've seen the issues that have been laid bare by COVID. And within this, the energy that we devote to organizational improvement should be part of a broader national mission to use that cliche, rebuild better, because we know we can be better, and we know there are so many things that we've learned about ourselves and our organizations during this pandemic.